Hey everybody, I'm Jon Meyers from Write Better Together. We're interrupting the internet. It's Emily Brooks.
All of it.
All of it, the entire internet. Emily, you don't like when we interrupt the internet. But you're here for it.
But we have to, because we're going to be having a webinar.
Yes.
In February.
How to stay motivated.
Yes, which really is kind of what our book is all about. So we have a lot to say about how to stay motivated.
7 Central, 8 Eastern. These are PM. Don't get up too early in the morning.
Oh, no, we are not going to be there.
7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific in California.
Perfect. If you want to join us, you can sign up on our website by going to our contact page at writebettertogether.com/contact, filling out the form and putting February webinar in the subject line.
That's what you do.
Yep. And that'll make sure that we send you the link, and we hope to see you there.
I'll be there.
Same.
Welcome everybody to Write Better Together. I'm Jon Meyers. Hey, look everybody, it's Emily Brooks.
Hello, Jon Meyers.
Hey, what are we talking about today?
Well, we have quite the guest.
Oh.
We have with us today R.J. Jacobs, psychologist and writer.
Wow.
Who I met at WriterFest in Nashville. So very excited to have him on. We're going to be talking about psychology in writing, like in storytelling, but also psychology for writers.
I saw him walking like down the hallway and like in the going into rooms and stuff, and I never got to talk to him. So I'll get to talk to him now.
But before we have him on, we're going to have listener responses. He's going to give a call to action. We're going to have a Hey Jon Meyers segment where I teach Jon Meyers something, and then we're going to have the final act where we play a silly game.
I just realized this whole time, instead of me responding audibly, I was shaking my head, which people
I know.
in their car can't hear that. Anyway, that sounds like it's quite the list.
It is quite the list. Thank you. The words must be said. They must be spoken.
Did you get out of your bubble this week?
So I wanted to share a different kind of getting out of the bubble, right? Because usually we talk about social interactions that we had, but also getting out of your bubble can be like putting yourself out there in your writing.
Correct.
So I wanted to share how I got out of my bubble and was disappointed. But there's a point to that story, because we talked a little bit about disappointment last time. So I submitted a short story that I had written to a journal back in November. I think it was November 2023. In March of 2024, they said, "You've been moved to the second round of readings, and we'll let you know in 2 weeks." 2 weeks passed by. A month passes by, 2 months, 3 months. I finally reach out to them and I'm like, "Hey, my story's still in the queue. I'm just wondering if I missed your email or whatever." They said, "Yeah, well, that's coming up next, so we'll let you know in a couple weeks." They sat on my story for over a year. I think it was about 400 days before I finally got
400 days, 23 hours, 17 minutes.
Yeah, I was counting. Before I got a letter saying that it wasn't for them. So I think, so this is part of the process, because it can take them a long time to read. But I was a little frustrated that they kept telling me, like promising responses and not giving me to them. And then I was also a little frustrated that this was a journal that only accepted non-simultaneous submissions, meaning I could, while I was waiting for that over a year, I was not able to submit to any other journals. So it's kind of like a story of, I want to encourage people to put themselves out there and to expect that it can take time, and to expect to be patient. And also just be aware, if you are, if somebody says that they don't take simultaneous submissions, just keep that in mind, that it may mean that you have to wait a while before you can submit your story again. And, it's really fine, because I have other things that I'm working on. And if if you're continuing to write short stories and you have that one back there, it's like, okay, it takes 400 days. I've got other stuff. And I think we've talked about that before, that the best way to deal with disappointment or with patience is just to keep the momentum going.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, we're going to have a webinar, but after this episode airs, so on the 3rd Thursday of February, about how to stay motivated. So that ties in well with that. But yeah, so we talked about that with Renee a bit, and what I wanted to say was, so my strategy that I voiced in the Renee episode, Renee Gutteridge, was I have no expectations, right? And so, especially as a screenwriter, the default is you never hear anything, and then if you do hear something, it could be 6 years later. If they want it, though, you'll hear right away as soon as they see it, right? But if it's just hasn't been read yet, and it is someone that gives rejections, which I hate that rejection letter thing. We talked about that. Should never have been called that in the first place. Then that's 6 months. That is so, or sometimes a year, and sometimes Bob's told the story on this show before. That 8 years later, he forgot that he even sent those people that thing. They're like, hey, is this thing still available? Yeah. And so just time takes time. But what I was going to point out was having no expectations. That's not what you just said. You said change your expectations. And so that's a different way of handling it. So I would handle it with, I just don't have any expectations, but your takeaway sentence in the story you just told was, just expect it could take a year and a half, and keep that in mind when you have when they don't allow simultaneous submissions. So you're kind of changing your expectations.
I realized as you said that why I may have framed it that way.
Okay.
And I think it's because on the website, it said that they would respond, I think, in like 6 months or something like that. So my expectations were what they had stated. And then I had to change my expectations beyond that. And then, so maybe that's what that has to, and then also because I knew that they would respond, because they say that they respond to every submission, whereas not everybody says that. You can look usually on an agent's page, they will say whether or not to expect a response. Others don't, and then you just don't know. And that's when it's like, okay, I'm not going to worry about it. The main thing I'll say, and again, I think we've said this before, don't go check your email or your query, whatever you're using, every 10 minutes because you're like, oh, maybe they'll respond now. I think it's better just set it aside and just move on, move to the next thing. But I do hope to submit that story somewhere else. I felt like that place was my best chance, but that could also, that's obviously not true. So we'll see. Somebody else might be interested.
Yeah. So I was going to say, you did not Bethany Smith that and go, great, now someone else can have it. And your initial response to that letter was not great. So now I know the person that really needs it is going to get it. Which is what, I mean,
we'll see.
But someone said that on Bethany Smith hasn't been on the episode because she's not a writer. But someone said that also, like when I pointed that out in the episode, one of our guests said, or maybe it's not that it wasn't the right time, but it wasn't even the right person, and now the right person is going to get it.
Yeah.
And it'll do even better things than it would have done at that place.
Yeah. And I'll also reevaluate the story and just see, like, okay, is there anything that I can improve as well? But
yay, great.
Yeah, great. How did you get out of your bubble?
Wait, I want you to act more.
I am relieved.
You did a great thing by submitting in the first place.
Yeah. Always submit.
So I got out of my bubble two ways. I did not go to the mailbox since the last time we talked, so it's really not a story. So I'm in this creative writing pedagogy group, and everyone in this group, they're like us, that teach at the college level, right? So this isn't even like middle school creative writing teach. And someone posts in there, and I won't say even what state that he's from. My student, I have a grad student, and he wants to know which poetry journals are the most widely circulated and which publishers have the largest poetry audience. I saw it like the next day, 2 days. 30 people had already answered him. There were 4 or 5 of those people, Dr. Hunley was one of them, who gave him an like, oh, well, Rattle would send out 8,000 copies if he made it to a certain level. And someone else said, oh, now I'm drawing a blank. Starts its initials are CC. Dang. Do you know the journal starts with CC? Like Cooper Creek or something like that. I'm not a poet.
So. No.
I'll look it up and I'll put it on the screen. And but anyway, so there were a handful of people that answered. There were 25 people who said, what do you care who reads it for? That's not what poetry. These are all college professors. It's a means of expression. You're not supposed to sell multiple copies. Like, who cares which blah blah blah. And you need to tell your student that he doesn't even need to be a poet if that's what he's concerned about. And as you can imagine, I laid into these 25 people. I'm like, first of all, he didn't say which one am I going to make the most money off of, right? And but there are some where you're more likely to make money if it's accepted than if you're not. But that's not what he was saying. He was saying, where will the most eyeballs see my poem? And which is a totally valid concern if you want to impact people's emotions. If you want to impact your girlfriend's emotion or your wife's emotion, then write her a poem or write in your journal. But if you want to impact a swath of your culture or a swath of your nation or whatever, then you want a lot of people to see it. And 75% of the responses were like, what, this is, we're telling him to hide it under a bushel.
Yeah. And I mean, he wasn't like, I'm going to change my writing to fix, to fit these journals so they'll publish it. Like,
correct.
Because that's important too. I was talking about, we've had my dad, Dean Deal, on with talking about indie artists, but he was talking to me the other day about how he tells the students a lot of the artists who are unhappy that he knows, if you ask, are you really happy and proud of what you are creating? Are the ones that didn't fall into, well, this will get me on the radio, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Because it's a job just like any other job. But it doesn't have to be one or the other. You can write what you're passionate about and still think, who out there, maybe my audience, that I can impact. And so I totally agree with you. Because artists, like songwriters, don't think that way. They're not like, oh, this is just for me, right? So why is it that in poetry we feel like it has to be just self-expression?
I agree 100%. The next layer of that was, of that 75% contingent of, you're going about this whole, you need to correct him while he's still 22 so he doesn't spend his whole life thinking that anyone's ever going to see his poetry. So of that contingent, there were half of them that said, and one of the good responses, one of the 5 good responses that gave him a name, half of the people that said you're going down the wrong path, and one of the good responses said, this is unknowable. There are no numbers for that out in the industry. So I took that as a challenge, because I'm a screenwriter. I'm not Poet Boy, right? Even though I have poetry, I've had poems published. Guess what? ISBN lists
Yeah.
the top 25, and they had just released it this, January of 2025. The top 25 poetry presses.
Yeah.
Based on the ISBN numbers that they've issued to these small presses. So they know they have the exact data. So don't tell me it's not knowable. It's been knowable ever since there's been ISBN numbers. And so why don't these professors know this? They're teaching grad students, and they don't even know their own industry. So that's number one.
Interesting.
Number two is ABN, American Bookseller something. Every 8 weeks, they release kind of like the Billboard Hot 100. They release the top sellers of poetry books, and it's called Indie Press Bestsellers every 8 weeks, so every 2 months. And that's a poll of 700 independent bookstores. And then they release that chart, and that chart's published. So I gave them a link to that. And that's even more current than, hey, these are all the ISBN numbers that we handed out. These are the things that really sold at indie bookstores. Now, of that top, I think there were 25 on that list too. Of that top 20, most of them were big. So even though it was called indie poem press or indie press chart or whatever, there were like Random House, and they're like, most of them were published by the big houses, but there were the small presses, the bigger small presses that those other 5 people that mentioned and said, oh, try this one or try that one. Those were on that list. So those 5 people gave, even though they only gave 1 or 2 small presses, they gave the right answers. But it's totally knowable. Monkey Boy right here was able to find it in 20 seconds. And these people their department heads need to call them into the office and have a talk with them.
Oh, goodness.
And they're from all over. They're from New York, California, Minnesota. Because I looked to see where these people were from. Like, how do you not know? That's their job, to teach these students, and they don't even know where,
Yeah.
So I got out of my bubble, and I got out of my bubble because I got out of my genre. I'm not known for my poetry prowess, but I certainly am capable of finding them the answer that they needed.
Yeah.
And that guy was totally appreciative. Another one of the people of the 5 that had an answer, they're like, oh, I didn't even realize this was out there. This is so helpful, very instructive. And so the people that were on the ball, they knew that, like, oh, I should have known this already.
And then you said, great, listen to my podcast, Write Better Together, and buy my book, right? Anyway.
I private messaged 2 of them and did that, but I did not do that to the 25 of them that were like,
yeah. Man.
You just need to write in your journal and turn it in for all they care about is grading the assignment.
It's interesting. And I mean, if that's your motivator, like, that's great, but that's not everybody's motivation, and that's okay. Like,
so, someone was like, I've taught in 3 MFA programs, and never once did we teach a class on how to market yourself. Like, that was a positive or something.
No, we definitely had a whole talk on that, because that's so important. Like, we also had a teacher who was a very successful author, and so of course we would talk about that. That was an important thing to him too. So
yeah, and Dr. Diamond talks about it, and they like, yes.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, man, we talked about writing a lot already. We do have a listener response.
Is it about writing?
It is. So in our recent episode with Stephanie L. Jones and Sarah Vesely, we talked about the mentor-mentee relationship. And I love this. So Emily Tucker Rhinelander responded, I am taking the call to action seriously. So Stephanie L. Jones challenged people, like, look for a mentor, right? She says, an acquaintance asked me to mentor her with her novel. I realize in hearing this podcast that mentoring her will also benefit me, just like the relationship between Stephanie L. Jones and Sarah Vesely has enriched each of them, and it will get me out of my bubble. So I love that, because mentorship really does grow you as well. Like even you answering that question in the Facebook comments or wherever that was, you learned something. So when I was tutoring, I learned like things that I may have known or was a little bit fuzzy that like were solidified because of how many times I had to repeat it. So I love that she's seeking that relationship out.
Yeah. Yes. And we talked about that in a previous episode where it never occurred to me to go to a writing group for something for me. Remember I said that, and the guest was like, "Oh, really?" And because I go to help the other people, and that's what happened, which is a reason why you should get out of your bubble. Is it's not always about you, the writer. It's about even if you're new, you have something you can teach someone who's been around forever because they didn't look at it that way, or they forgot 20 years ago they used to look at it that way.
Or when I have students like workshop each other's papers, they're for peer review, I've had some people be like, I didn't get very helpful feedback. And I'm like, but that wasn't actually the point, because the point was that you practice looking for errors and things that can be improved in somebody else's writing. So if you can give people great advice, that's wonderful. But it's almost more for the person who's giving the feedback.
Yeah, 100%.
But also, Emily, I think it sounds like that person can also grow from you. And so I think that's a really great thing to do.
Keep in mind that what Stephanie said, that mentee has to come prepared.
Yes.
That was a big takeaway from that.
It's definitely like a
conversation.
100% kind of relationship. You both have to put in input. So I'm so excited for this conversation. Let me introduce you all to RJ Jacobs. He has practiced as a psychologist since 2003. He maintains a private practice in Nashville, focusing on a wide variety of clinical concerns. After completing a postdoctoral residency at Vanderbilt, he has taught abnormal psychology, presented at numerous conferences, and routinely performed PTSD evaluations for veterans. His novel, titled And Then You Were Gone, was published in 2019. His second novel, Somewhere in the Dark, was published in 2020. And those are mysteries. So here's our conversation with RJ Jacobs.
And we're back. I'm still Jon Meyers. Hey, look, everybody. It's still Emily Brooks.
Hello, Jon Meyers. And hey, look, everybody. It's RJ Jacobs.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
I heard he's a doctor. Is he some kind of doctor? What? Is this true?
There's a rumor. Unconfirmed. I'm a psychologist.
Oh, no. We have to lay down? No one told me we had to lay down.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness.
Jon, tell me about your childhood.
No, that you just wait. That's what's coming in about 5 minutes, right, Emily?
This isn't a free therapy session, Jon Meyers.
You have no idea how many of our guests have actually picked that scab open, I'll say, on this show.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Jon Meyers likes to ask our guests hard questions as well. Like, do you like your dad?
Oh, that's much more polite than I would have put it. All right. Why are we really here?
Well, so RJ, you have written 2 mystery novels.
I've actually written 4 around.
Oh, 4.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. So the bio that I read is like outdated.
I guess so.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about those? And then I want to get into if and or how your psychology background affected the writing of those books.
Yeah, sure. I'll just kind of start talking for a second here.
Yeah, go for it.
So my first novel came out in 2019. It was called And Then You Were Gone. And it was about a psychologist who has bipolar disorder. And she and her boyfriend take a sailboat out onto the lake. And when she wakes up, he is not there. But she doesn't believe that he is drowned. So she begins her own investigation.
Wow.
And about a year later, my second novel came out. It was set in Nashville. It's called Somewhere in the Dark. And it was about a country music singer who was mysteriously murdered, and the only person who really could be trusted to find the killer was the person who was stalking her. And so her and the detective became kind of an unlikely duo. In 2022, my third novel came out called Always the First to Die. Gosh, it's so funny. These things seem like a long time ago now.
Yeah. Yeah.
That one is about a former horror movie actress whose life begins to resemble the plot of the film she starred in. And then the most recent one came out in 2023, and it was called This Is How We End Things. And it's about an academic department that is running a psychology experiment that's somewhat controversial. And as things often do in murder mysteries, things go awry, and not everybody makes it to the second act.
I love that you explained all of those, because we've talked a lot on here about like having a good pitch. And that's like a masterclass because like all of those pitches were so succinct and so compelling.
Yeah, I do think that actually like that's kind of a skill, is to be able to say in a sentence or two kind of what the book is about. And there's a little bit of learning that goes on as you do that, because you can kind of gauge when you have somebody's interest. You can kind of tell like the nonverbals are telling you like they're into it, or even like a keyword or two like will captivate somebody's interest or will really dissuade people. And so for my third book, there were some people who, when I said the phrase horror movie, there were some people who kind of almost put up their hands and said, "Oh, no, thanks. I don't like that." And then there are other people who kind of leaned in. And you can kind of tell or sort of get a sense of who's who.
What did we do?
Blank screen. Absolutely. No facial recognition of either phrase.
What a safe answer that was. So your first one came out in 2019. Yeah. And so I'm jumping in with a question here. How long did that one take, and how long had you been a doctor before you started?
Oh, yeah. So that book took me about a year to write. I finished my PhD in 2003. So I'd been a psychologist for many years before that came out. It was actually writing that I kind of came back to. I had put it on the shelf for a long time, just, pursuing career, family life. And then after a time, I guess around the time that I was turning 40, I said, gosh, if I'm going to try and take a crack at this, I better get going. So I bought the laptop that we're actually talking on right now. Still working just fine, and kind of got to work on some drafts.
And was that the thing? Was that the impending 40th birthday? Was that the thing that said, I'm going to really do this? Or was there a different pivot point?
Yeah, I think that I had been wanting to do something creative for some time. I had written, as many people do, I had written when I was like in high school and college, but some of that stuff is just very unfocused. I didn't have a lot of formal training in how to get going with that. And frankly, not any real sense at all about what the business of publishing looked like. Yeah. And so, some of that stuff, it just really was not anything that would ever be published. But I had just sort of stored it as a dream or something that I wanted to get back to. And so a lot of it is about making the time to try and pursue it. I guess a birthday is sort of a time when you take stock. So
yeah, for sure. Do you have a book, one of those books that you just mentioned, that you felt like this was the one that I had the most fun writing?
My second book was set in Nashville, and I wrote it from first person point of view, and I probably wrote it the fastest. And it's pretty fun to write in the city that you're living in. And it's actually pretty fun to read a story like that because, a lot of stories are set in places like New York or the English countryside. And if you don't live there, or if you haven't visited there, or even have a clear sense about what it's like, it's not super vivid. But yeah, I can't tell you the number of people who read my second book and said, oh, that happened at the Starbucks on West End. I've been at that Starbucks. And so there's a more kind of canny recognition, I think, that goes on when you recognize the setting that closely.
Yeah, that's funny because when you said it was set in Nashville, I was like, ooh.
Well, and you, RJ, you lit up on that one. So I was almost going to butt in and say, let me guess which one it was. And so when you said the 4 stories, when you said Nashville is when you lit up on that.
Yeah. Speaking of nonverbals.
Yeah.
That was the book that sort of got a little bit lost in the shuffle because it came out in August of the pandemic year.
Yeah.
And so, this was about, 2 months, 3 months before the election in 2020. And, try getting anybody interested in your mystery novel during that time. It's almost impossible. And so we were trying to think about ways to promote the book. It's very difficult to do. There were times where Rhea Fry, I don't know if you know her, she's also a Nashville author. She's excellent. And I were doing these like virtual events with like book clubs, and we would set up this laptop. This was at the time where people didn't really have very much practice with doing things virtually at all. So the lighting was kind of terrible, or, she had a kind of a better sense of it than I did. But I sort of think fondly about the innovation that came from those days, but it was tough sledding there. And I really had thought that book was going to be kind of I don't know. As I was writing it, the pandemic hadn't happened yet. So I didn't imagine promoting it under those circumstances, but I like that story a lot.
Yeah, there's so much that we can't control. We actually talk about that a lot of like, you can set your own goals, but you don't always know what other people are going to do or how they're going to respond.
Oh, sure. So many variables in life. And, of all the people who were affected by the pandemic, me having a tough time promoting my novel is on the far low end of the spectrum of seriousness. So I don't want to cry too hard about it, but it did end up kind of getting lost.
Right.
So since the next 2 didn't take place in Nashville, tell us where they took place and tell us not just where they took place, but why you chose to tell those 2 stories in the next 2 places.
The 3rd book was set in the Florida Keys. And I grew up in Southwest Florida, and I was looking for a remote location that hadn't been done before. And I guess I got the idea, I think it was Hurricane Matthew that had hit the Keys and knocked out the power for a long time. At some point I was thinking about what it would be like to be down there. And so this is one of the fun parts about writing a story like this is you just do research. So I called a resort where I had stayed years before and asked somebody if they would just talk with me about what it was like to be in the Keys during that time. And they described a really pretty spooky setting with a lot of candles and, no real artificial light after the sun went down. And it kind of got me going. And, in the Keys, there's really only one road in and one road out. And if that road is blocked off, you pretty much have a locked room mystery setting set up for you. So I got pretty excited about that. And plus, I'd always wanted to do a story sort of set in Florida. A buddy of mine's parents owned a marina when I was a kid. And, there's something really, I guess, kind of romantic or a certain mystique to nautical things. And I guess at the time I was thinking about things that you could do from a thriller perspective with like spear guns and pressurized air and all kinds of things with boats and anchors and stuff. And so it was a pretty easy choice.
I love that. I'm a fantasy author, but it's a very nautical based book.
Oh, cool.
And I have no knowledge of those things. So I also had to do a lot of research.
It also has like its own nomenclature. Its own world, all the rules and laws that go with that stuff. And so
absolutely.
You learn a little something too when you're doing research like that about, maritime law and how decisions are made during an emergency and all that kind of stuff.
At least with fantasy, I get to make up.
You get to make all the rules. That's right. Yeah. Literally a different world.
Yeah.
The last book was set in a small town, a college town in North Carolina. And I was with my kids touring colleges, and we were, I can't call the town Winston-Salem, and I can't call the University of Wake Forest, but that's where we were. And, you know, I had to set it in the South. There's a big snowstorm, and I had to set it in the South because, as you know, snow will really shut down a town in the South. It makes it just kind of impossible to get around.
Right.
So I had to snow in a bunch of graduate students and make it so that they had to kind of be isolated on campus for a period of time until the mystery was solved.
That's really interesting how both of those books you mentioned creating a sense of isolation or actual like reality of isolation to add to that intensity.
It's a little bit of a trope. And, you know, in 2025, technology kind of becomes a problem with telling some of these stories. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of dead cell phone batteries, and there's a lot of like drop signals and, you know, ways of trying to kind of get around the fact that a lot of times it's pretty easy to tell who was where, and pretty easy to get in touch with whoever you want. So you have to be a little bit creative about that kind of stuff without being terribly hokey.
Right.
So,
were there not as much as in the last two, but in the first two, are there moments of isolationism? Is that element present in your earlier works as well?
I don't
Locked
think
in a room
as
or something?
much. You know, in the last two, I wanted to play with isolation, and the last one specifically is pretty close to like an Agatha Christie style locked room mystery where there's only a certain number of suspects. So you can't.
So I wondered if the pandemic changed you. I wondered if the pandemic changed you that way.
Oh yeah,
before
great
the
question.
pandemic, you didn't look at that, and then after it, you did.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. Yeah, I think I was just sort of leaning into the sort of the stylistic elements of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've kind of skirted around it, but I mean, all of the stories that you mentioned have some kind of psychological element in some way. So how does your background affect your choices when choosing plot lines, when choosing characters?
Sure. You know, I've thought a lot about this question, and it's kind of a lengthy answer, and so I hope I don't like prattle on here. But
no, I'm ready for it.
You know, I wish that I had more elegance to the way that I could answer how it informs character. But I feel like, in fact, I have to work harder to speak to character because I'm so situationally tuned in. I'm kind of a behaviorist at heart, and you know, the behavior is the most predictive element of somebody's actions. A lot of times, you know, if you put 3 different characters in the same set of circumstances, they'll all behave the same way. And I have to really try to be pretty nuanced about backstory and character because that's the arc of a story. That's the storytelling part of it. You know, the science of it is the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And the circumstances really dictate what's about to happen. But that's not really that great of a story unless you really weave in who somebody is. And that's what makes it meaningful. I have to be a little bit careful that I don't have a psychologist or a disorder in every story that I write, because I feel like that would get kind of trite after a while. But I kind of can't help but think that way just a bit because of the line of work that I do. I will say that being a psychologist probably gives me probably a clearer sense of just how intense a certain period of time is in somebody's life. And so, you know, I write mystery and thriller type novels, and, you know, a lot of people, when they go see a psychologist, they go into therapy, they're having not an easy go of it. A lot of times it's a very intense time in their life. And sometimes that intensity, I think, is kind of what would be for like the makings of a good story. I will say that it's actually kind of the other way around, where I feel like the writing part of it has really helped me as a therapist.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because it's a pretty solitary hobby. And I obviously have a very like social job with a lot of face time. And so I don't, like many people, my battery kind of runs down over the course of the day. And so it's nice to kind of retreat into a place where, you're just kind of doing your own thing. And I think that that's one of the great things about writing something novel length is like basically nobody knows what you're doing. It's kind of a secret world and it's kind of a secret project. And, when you try to market it, the fact that nobody cares is an obstacle. But when you're working on it, it's actually kind of a benefit because people don't keep asking you about it. You can go at your own pace. And it's this nice little oasis or kind of refuge that you can drop into whenever you care to and work a little bit more. And so it's nice in that regard. And that I feel like there's a kind of a life balancing part of it for me. But also, I feel like it gives me a better perspective in like, this is going to sound very corny, so pardon me for this, but helping my patients kind of edit their own story where, when you first put out a first draft, you don't really have a good sense of the perspective of certain elements of the story. And so your editor really helps you figure out, gosh, this part needs to be bigger. This part could be condensed. This part you need to draw out. This part maybe you should cut entirely. I feel like in some ways I kind of help people, that way of thinking has helped me like help people figure out, gosh, okay, this event happened, but what happens next? And how big of a deal do we want to make this? And so it's a little corny, but I feel like it helped me in that way for sure.
No, I love that analogy so much. That's really cool. And I think as we just had an episode where we were talking about memoir and how it can be so healing to look at your life as a story.
Yeah.
And so that really makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Memoirs are so wonderful. And if I feel like I'm in a reading rut, that's usually my go-to because they're just so compelling.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Just knowing a story is true. And I think it's inspiring to see what somebody has been through and what they've overcome.
I think that's right. Yeah.
So, yeah, I agree.
When you said about how after your social battery is worn down and now you get to retreat to this and no one really knows what you're working on. In a couple weeks, we'll have on Kirsten Modglin, who you may have met because she was at Writer Fest as well, who just finished book 50. She doesn't have that. She has, people are waiting.
Yeah.
They're waiting on the next, even though they're not a series, there were people there waiting. When is 49 coming out?
Yeah.
And when you're on book 50, how do you think that will change when you know that there are people know that you're working on number 5 and 6 and 7 like that?
Oh man.
I guess I'd love to have that problem. So I have a hard time thinking that far in the future. At this rate, I don't know that I would live to be 120.
No, she did all that. Like she's done that in 8 years.
Hey, that's amazing. Some people are really that prolific. I'm much more plodding, when it comes to like the pace of those things. So usually it takes me about a year to do it. Actually, if I'm not hurrying, it's better. And it would take me about a year and a half, but I still work full time. So, in some ways, like I have to kind of respect the time that, that both of those parts take.
Do you think it would forget the fans, but if there's someone, we need 2 in the next 3 years, right? If you have that pressure, how would that change your story?
Yeah, that happened to me one time in the 4 where I really had to hustle. I'm glad you said that about in the beginning about the podcast being family friendly because I almost just used a swear word. Wow! But I had to move my tail.
Yeah.
To get it done, and in some ways, it's like, it kind of expands and contracts to the amount of time that you have for it. But there's other times where I guess you can't help but wonder, like, am I rushing this? You know, there's no time to have writer's block. I mean, the other part of it is that like, man, I really respect anybody who does anything creative because, you know, I have a real clear sense of just how much it takes. You know, you get a lot out of it, and the creative process is very rewarding, and you feel a certain, almost like cleanliness kind of inside you when you do something creative. Kind of hard to describe, but it also takes a lot. And you know, you got to be careful about making too many commitments, and you've got to be comfortable canceling things and telling people, sorry, I can't make that. And you know, I think that people who are more successful than I am, probably even better than I am at being comfortable letting people down. And that's a tough part of it, is really like prioritizing the time. And it's a very weird thing. It's not, at least at the part where you're writing, you're very siloed. It's not very collaborative at all at that point. And, you know, you really have to make kind of a claim to the world that your time doing this solitary project is actually valuable, actually more valuable than, you know, going to a game or a birthday party or somebody's special event. That in a way you're saying like, what I'm doing is more important than that. And sometimes relationships kind of take a hit. I can see how that happens. So I don't know if you know, to do 50, I think that's a special person.
She's definitely an outlier in that way.
Yeah.
So the solitary aspect of it, where it just gives you your time. We kind of know Barry Friedman is a stand-up comedian, a road comedian. So he's surrounded all day by people, and he's surrounded by an audience. But his memoirs that he's written about his dad, and his first one was about his son who passed away, that gave him the time away from this audience, this like massive, I don't want to say massive, but this giant crowd. And then he would go back to the hotel at night. And that's what I was thinking when you were talking about the solitude of it.
Yeah, I also think that it's something that some people do for a time in their life. That in the same way that, you know, people who are work in any profession, they're a professional athlete or they're a teacher or they're a police officer. Sometimes you tend to think that that's their identity, but actually it's just kind of a job that people do sometimes for a couple of years. And I think that sometimes people drop in and out of being a writer, and that's just fine. Actually, I think there's a lot of things to do with your time in this world. And, you know, if you don't feel like you're particularly inspired, I think there's other creative stuff a person could do.
Yeah, I do think we put a lot of pressure on identity of like, it's got to be this one thing.
Yeah. I think that helps sometimes when you're trying to kind of get that first contract, you're trying to like, you know, find the energy to do the marketing part of it. I think the pressure sometimes can be a help, but there's other times where it feels like a hindrance, and it really feels like it kind of takes away from the creativity. In fact, some people who, I mean, you just mentioned her with 50 books. Gosh, I feel like if I had that kind of pressure to be a professional author where I was only making a living doing it, I've worried at times that would impact my ability to be creative.
Interesting. Yeah.
And she's the like, that's not about her, but she's the opposite, because when there's like, seriously, if book 46 fails, oh well, 47's coming out in 3 months.
And that's the mindset to have. And I really admire what she's doing. Everybody's wired differently.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, like, what are your personal goals, and like, how do you want to live your day-to-day life, and not to measure against, well, this person's doing this thing, or I gotta do this thing, unless it's like inspiring. Obviously, like if you're inspired by that, then pursue that. But if it's like you feel overwhelmed and pressured, then maybe reevaluate.
Speaking of fathers, So Emily and I taught a master class this summer, and the subject of fathers came up. Emily has the most supportive father in the world, and he's wonderful. He's been on the show. My father, who's now passed away, was not that way. In that room, of the 7 people that took the class, 4.5, 5 of them, because one wouldn't admit, all did not like their fathers. How, when we're not, this class wasn't about fathers, when this class was about the creative process, a part of the creative process, how did 5 out of 7 people, 6 if you count me, wind up in that same room, not when that wasn't the topic? There you go. How's that question? No one asked you that on those other 7 podcasts.
No, that's a brand new question. So the question is, how does the perception of your relationship with your dad impact your desire to be creative?
Well, yeah. And how did those, like, it was specifically those 7 people, right? There were 300 people at the conference, and then maybe 50 of them stayed for the master classes on the day after the conference. And so there was 7 in this master class. There were 6 in this one. There were 10 in that one. How did we wind up with those 7?
Well, what made you go?
No, well, we were teaching it.
Oh, I see.
Emily and I were teaching it.
I see.
And then, so I'm saying in the audience or in the students, 5 out of 7, and they were open about it. Other than the one that was kind of hesitant, they were open about it. And one was a Christian psychiatrist and who had dad issues. And so it's just always fascinated me, because I had a boss once who said that students who don't like their fathers strive harder to please male instructors. But we were a team. Emily and I were a team of instructors, and and these were adults. These weren't college students, right? These were 50-year-old people, and who were still struggling with their father issues. How did they all wind up in the same room? Is what I.
Well, all right. I'll try to take a crack at that and say,
okay.
First of all, the social science researcher in me has to point out that you've got too small of a sample size to extrapolate. An N of 7 is not big enough. Certainly not for generalizability about something as expansive as that topic.
Okay.
Yes.
Secondly, I think that there's so many individual differences in how an experience will affect somebody. So, there was a disappointment that happened in my family this week, and I was sort of reflecting on this and trying to give some good advice. And I said, gosh, just about everything that's been a letdown in my life later on has turned out to be a good thing. And so I think that, I don't know exactly what makes for a great dad. I sure give it my best as a dad, but I think what would make for a good father figure for one person might not be the same for somebody else. So something might be inspiring, but I also think that there's all kinds of ways to learn life lessons.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. It's an impossible, that specific scenario, it's impossible to know. But I am curious, like, how as creatives we are so impacted by other people's approval or other people's respect. And then how do we move past that, right? Because like Jon Meyers was saying, I have very supportive parents, so that's not really something that I've had to deal with. But I do worry about I still sometimes worry about what are they going to think if I show them this thing that I wrote, or what are my friends going to think if I show them this?
Oh man, I think everybody thinks that. I think that, I'm not sure if it ever goes away, the self-consciousness. Yeah. And, it's so vulnerable to have your artwork out there for people to judge and critique and tell you what they think of it. And some critiques really are much better than others and much more thought out than others. But I would challenge you to find not just any writer, but any artist who doesn't enjoy somebody telling him, hey, I thought that was really great. In a way, you almost kind of can't think that way too much while you're doing it. Because I think if you're trying to kind of play to the expectations of what you think is going to please an audience, in some ways, I don't think it works terribly well, or, if you tried to sort of fill in the blanks, it comes across as being derivative. So by the time you get there, it's like that party's already over. So I think, and you're truly the writer is the one who spends the most time with the book, of course. So I think when somebody's just starting out and they ask me for advice, I usually tell them to try and just write the weird book that they like, because they're the one who's going to spend all the time with it. And everybody else, their experience of it will go pretty fast, but they're the one ultimately who has to be cool with it. I think that being a confident artist means being able to hang with yourself and being able at the end of the day to say, I like what I did. I'm happy with what I just did.
I think it's easy to fall into that trap of people pleasing when you're in a workshop scenario and you have a professor you're trying to please, or you have friends in there that you're trying to please, or you're in or even if you're in a writing group, there may become well, this writing group's only likes it when I write this kind of thing. And it is hard to go, you know what, I'm going to write something that maybe they won't like, but hopefully can still give good feedback on. And maybe my professor won't like the content, but he'll probably still have some good feedback to provide. It is hard. I caught myself doing that a lot during my bachelor's in my creative writing classes, just trying to please the professor. And I realize now, he would have been just happy with whatever, I didn't have to do that.
Yeah. But, I think that that's the way that somebody gets started. You're trying to do it right. You're trying to learn lessons. I think that for a writer who's just starting out, there's really no shame in trying to copy somebody that you admire. I think that's how most writers start, is they have a writer that they admire or a story that they admire, and they try to do something similar. Mm-hmm. And I think that unless you get started that way, you're kind of lost. Everybody needs kind of a guide. But then ultimately, they say that it's all been done before, but hopefully you've got a new take on something, or you've got an original way of telling a story that makes it stand out.
Yeah, for sure.
So far, there's maybe been 3 sections of things that you've addressed. They've overlapped and stuff, but managing expectations seems to be the thread that's running through those 3. And the question I was going to ask before, which I'll ask now, is when you went into your profession, not the writer part, the doctor part, there are psychologists and psychiatrists. Some will specialize in child development, and some will specialize in addiction, and some will specialize in PTSD. What do you think inside that person steers them towards that thing? And there's people that start and they're like, oh, I'm going to be a social worker, and they're like, oh, I can't be a social worker, I'm going to go in this other direction, but they still stay in the field of psychology. What do you think? You're interested in PTSD, and because I read that on your bio somewhere, and so what draws you to that instead of some other worthy, noble cause? And does that have anything to do with expectations?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a nuanced answer. I think that over the course of kind of let me back up. I think there's sometimes something about the person that makes them a particularly good fit for a certain population. And I noticed this when my kids were getting a little bit older, that I started to work with more teenagers and families. And until I had really had an experience that would kind of lend itself to that, I didn't have a lot of insights probably to share. But having been through that experience, both as a former teenager myself and having had teenagers, it made it so that I had kind of more to say. And so that made it more of a niche. I think when I was first starting out and I was working at the Vanderbilt campus, I was hardly older than some of the grad students and undergraduate students myself. And so a lot of the conflicts that people who are on that campus as students would be facing, as the practitioner, you haven't been that far removed from having faced some of those things yourself. So I think there's a phase of life element to it. I think that, certainly the idea that many people have is that people get into that field trying to answer questions about themselves. So it's really kind of no surprise that somebody who maybe has been through some trauma would be interested in dealing with trauma, or somebody who had a particularly disrupted childhood might be interested in working with children. I will say that also, like, there's elements of it that are just personality types. I really admire people who have the kind of capacity to sit there and do like play therapy with kids, because it takes so much patience and it's so indirect. I'm really not, I hope that doesn't make me sound super impatient, even though I kind of am. But I feel like it's a special person who is really suited to that kind of imaginary play, who can slip in some meaningful moments while doing something so indirect. And so I think setting too, I mean, sorry to just really free associate here, John, but I also think that sometimes the fit between the personality and the work environment is pretty predictive of how happy the person's going to be staying in that environment. And so some of the jobs that are in psychology are in hospitals, and some people just don't care to work in medical settings, but other people really do.
It's interesting how that kind of ties into us talking about different types of writers too, and what their goals are and what they're trying to do with their writing, and even the genres that we choose to write in. Like you've chosen to write mystery, and particularly your characters and settings and things that are closely associated with your experiences in various ways.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, Emily. And it makes me think about people who write. A lot of times people will ask you what sort of books you read. And I think a challenge is to not only read in the genre that you write in, but gosh, I don't know that I've ever read a fantasy novel. And hearing that you write in that genre makes me want to kind of pick one up and sort of see what it's all about. It's certainly a growing interest area. I've never read a romance novel. I think a lot of guys would probably say that too. I don't know that that's going to be like, top of my list of things to do this weekend, but I'd be curious to look at one and sort of see the themes of what's coming out. I read a science fiction novel for one of the book club that I was in a couple of years ago, and it was great. And I kind of forgot how much I enjoyed reading in that genre. So hard to tell. And then, in the same way that I think that people like, if you're an academic researcher, it almost pays off to be specialized to the point of being hyper-specialized and siloed. And so you become the researcher who is specifically knowledgeable about zebrafish and nonverbal communication because you've written like 30 papers on it. And in a way that kind of becomes your identity. In the same way, I think that as a writer, you've got to be careful that you don't just become the person who writes a certain kind of book. And I actually really admire it when my friend David Bell wrote a YA novel a couple of years ago, and he also writes mysteries and thrillers. It was great. It was great. I so admired that he did it.
We're also friends with David Bell.
Future guest David.
Do y'all know David? He would be great. Yeah, he would be great on this.
Yeah, he's awesome.
Yeah, he's also a professor.
Yes.
Yeah. Speaking of academic research, so
he blurbed our book.
Oh, that's great.
That's great. He's on the blurb.
Yeah, he's awesome.
Yeah. That was actually, I don't normally read thrillers, but I read one of his and I learned from it. And so, it is fun to explore other genres and to learn from them. And what's interesting is some genres really can encapsulate more than one genre. Like fantasy right now really just means it takes place in another world, but it can be heist, it can be mystery, it can be thriller, it can be romance. There's so many different. So there are some fantasy books that I'm like, I don't really want to do that because I'm not really into that type, like that genre, that secondary genre, I guess.
No, I think that there's a lot of, I think romance is the genre that has the most subgenres.
Yeah, probably.
But I think that like, if you're like, technically, if your main character is a teenager, it's YA. And I ran into this a little bit with my last book where the publisher wanted to market it as a dark academic novel. And
oh, interesting.
I had not really heard that phrase when I was writing the novel, so I didn't know what that meant. But then, people will chime in about whether or not it's dark academic enough. Does it meet the criteria? And all of those sort of distinctions are things that go on in people's minds who aren't you. So
yeah, that's interesting.
In some ways it's kind of humorous, but in other ways it's like it kind of gets back to what we were talking about meeting and exceeding expectations about what somebody hopes is going to happen when they pick up your book.
David Bell has one of those murder on the campus.
Yeah,
books.
He does. The Finalists is that one.
Yeah.
That's the one where they're trying to get a scholarship.
Yeah.
Were you in the class where, Emily, were you in the class where we read Flyover?
Yeah, Layover.
Oh, Layover. Sorry, Dr.
Yeah.
Bell. So a different professor assigned his book to one of our. We were in a summer class together. Emily and I were, and so that leads to this will be my final question. Imagine, or has this happened already, someone studying your book in a college class. What do you think about that?
I got pretty close to that because I did a little talk at one point with University of Tennessee, Knoxville, with somebody on the psychology faculty there about the ethics themes in the psychology experiment in my most recent book. Because that's part of the story, is that they have really pressed the boundaries of what is even conceivable as ethical. And it's a controversial study. So figuring out the reasons why it would be controversial or actually would never pass an institutional review board can be kind of a learning tool.
Interesting.
Very cool. I love that.
Yeah. Do you have a final question, Emily?
Oh, I'm trying to think of I'm like,
well, think of your call to action, RJ, while Emily thinks of her final question.
Oh, gosh. Well, when I first understood the question, I understood it to be a writing tip. And so I was thinking about how I don't use many of those, but sometimes if you run into a place where you're kind of stalled out, actually, I think it's interpretable, not that you don't like writing anymore, but sometimes there's a hole in the plot. And so one exercise that I liked that I didn't expect to like was to have, it's a little out there actually, but that suits me, have a conversation with each of your characters in which they're trying to tell you something. And so it takes just a second to kind of write it from their point of view, to jump into their point of view and think about what they as a character are trying to tell you as an author. And I think that's great. And sometimes you have insights and you don't realize you've been shorthanding something, or it actually tells you something interesting about the story, because sometimes a story from, the villain doesn't think they're villain. So sometimes you learn a little something.
Yeah. And how do they get that to us, Emily?
Oh, they can. So if y'all want to send us those exercises or tell us how it went, you can respond in the comments on social media, wherever you see this episode when we share it, or you can respond in the YouTube comments, or you can go to writebettertogether.com/podcast to find our show notes and respond there. It's never too late. We always like to hear your responses. And I actually do have one more question that exercise brought up.
All right.
Brought to mind is in the very big, earlier when we were talking about your characters and how you were thinking about, how the circumstances and how they would behave and the past being predictors of behavior, how much depth do you go into your character creation in figuring out their psychology, their motives, their, all of the things before you start writing?
A bit. I've become more of an outline guy. In mystery thriller, I think that it's not as character driven as some other genres. I think it's more story driven. Yeah. And so in that, you have to be really thinking about when the twists are going to come. But yeah, sometimes it's fun to sort of turn everything around and see, really dive into what somebody's motivation is. If I will say that if the villain doesn't have a good motivation, I think the story just usually doesn't work. I think if it's
I agree, yeah,
corny motivation, or it feels like it's too hollow, it seems like the rest of the story really kind of like doesn't work very well. And in some ways, that's some of my favorite feedback I've ever gotten from people who have read my book, especially my first book, because the main character had bipolar disorder. And people said, "Hey, gosh, thanks for not making that the villain and not making that like the reason why the person committed the crime is that they're just crazy." That's actually not a good explanation.
That's such a trope too,
and it's just not satisfying. It's not.
I had a student who was like, he said that he had schizophrenia, and he was like, in all the movies and all the shows and all the documentaries, like they're portraying people with schizophrenia as these villains.
That's right.
And so I think that's great to portray characters. It's just like, this is just normal. This doesn't make, like, that's not a motivation. That doesn't make somebody evil.
I will say that one thing I've run into a little bit is nobody wants to be anyone who has a nefarious motivation. If they feel like that represents the group that they're in, a lot of times they don't like it. Down to the level of like research scientists or academics or music producers or whoever the person is who ultimately is holding the bag. Sometimes you hear from somebody who got offended that
oh no.
Yeah, but it's just a story.
Well, I 100% agree. I watched a show that was a mystery recently where I was so into it, and then they got to they finally found out who did it, and you're like, really, that person, and for that reason, really? And it was just so disappointing. So that makes sense that's what mattered. Like when you're doing character like that one really matters a lot.
Yeah.
Right? Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
This was wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great. So glad to have you on.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
And we're back. Oh my gosh. It's about time we had a psychologist on here.
I know. That's why I was like, okay, he has to be on the show. So glad that we got to talk to him.
For the next 6 episodes when he comes back.
Yeah, let's just be a series. Like
I'll have a session with him. You can have a session with him. Then we'll have some of our guests from the past each have a session with him.
Yeah.
Poor RJ Jacobs.
Hey, Jon Meyers.
Yes.
It's cold outside.
Oh, I'm sorry. You should move to Florida or something.
So some people claim, and this is because you are from the north,
yes.
more
yes.
north than I am. So I'm curious if you've experienced this. But some people say, so I was having a conversation with someone who lived in a colder area, and she was like,
unthaw? They say unthaw? Is that what you're going to tell me?
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
Dang.
She was talking about how it feels colder here. Why might some people experience southern winters as being colder? Because I've also seen videos of people saying they're from Alaska and they still experience southern winters as being colder, even if the temperature is much higher.
Well, let me just say that the first time I went to college, I went in South Dakota, and there was a time where it was 64 below, not the wind chill. And they told us, I was 18 then at that time, right? They told us not to leave the dorms because it was record cold even for South Dakota. So, of course, I had to leave the dorm. They can't tell me that I got to stay put. And there was already like 2 feet of snow on the ground. And so like the sidewalks are shoveled, but then the snow is like up to your knees on both sides of the sidewalk, right? And so I went out in 64 below zero. And first of all, the snow was packed as hard. It was like concrete. It was so hard. But I lasted maybe 3 seconds. And my skin froze. Like, you know how ice road truckers, they have like ice hanging from their beard or whatever? That happened immediately. Like everything on me froze immediately. And I'm like, oh, no wonder they don't want you to go out. But I don't remember it feeling cold. It just felt painful.
That's interesting. And I will say, it's when they say that they experience it as colder, it is not as dangerous. And it is not as, like you see people who will like pour water and it freezes on the way to the ground or something like that. Yeah. Like that's not going to happen here.
So to answer your question, my guess is it because of the wind? Because like in Chicago.
That's what I thought.
Because in Chicago it's cold, but it's lake effect snow. And I don't know.
That's what I thought, but it's not the wind because it gets windy in other places too. It's actually the same reason why it feels hotter in the South.
Humidity?
It is the humidity.
Okay. Tell me this fake news. I don't believe this.
So, and it obviously depends on the humidity levels. But essentially, so we know why in the heat humidity affects us. It's because our sweat doesn't like evaporate, which is what cools you down. Here, it's because it's not necessarily sweat, but it's the moisture that gets onto you. So from the air. So it's so moist that your clothes are getting, sorry for people who hate the word moist. Your clothes are getting moist. And it takes more to warm up liquid than it does your skin. And so if your skin even is slightly wet, it's going to feel colder.
So funny that you mentioned this because it's been really cold in my undisclosed location, in your location in Tennessee and in Chicago where my brother still is. And one day it didn't seem like one of these 20-degree days and 16 degrees, whatever. It didn't seem that cold. And so I called him and I'm like, does it seem like this is weird? Because yesterday it was 30 and today it's 16 and yesterday seemed colder. And so it's funny that you brought this up today. This was 3 weeks ago. And he's like, no, it's the same here. He's like, I just shoveled the driveway. And I was like, he said it felt like it was spring out. And it's 10 degrees. And yesterday it was 20 and it was colder. And so now you've explained why.
Well, and you're right that the wind can affect it. So the wind absolutely, because we talked about wind chill, can make it feel colder.
Does the wind affect humidity? I don't know.
That's a good question. But the reason why I said it wasn't the wind is because it can be just as windy in different places. So there you go. It's because of the humidity.
Wow. I can tell. Can you tell? Do you know the temperature? Like if you walk out, can you go?
Lately, like sometimes I'm like, oh, it feels like it's 50 degrees and it's like 35. So not really. Oh.
Because I can know the temperature within, I don't know, 5 degrees. Like I can walk outside and go, it's 54 and it's really 56 or something. And so I don't know that the cold feels cold. When I said it was fake news, I think when I walked outside in Chicago and it was 20, I think I would go, oh yeah, this is 20 or 23 or whatever. And if I walked outside here, it was 20 or 23. I think it would feel the same to me.
I mean, I'm just going off of what they said.
What I want to know is how do the birds experience it? Do they experience humidity? Because they have feathers.
I think, no, those are ducks. I was like, because I've seen a bunch of ducks in the water lately, and I'm like, how are they not cold? Well, it's because their feathers are like moisture wicking. They don't actually get very wet. But I don't know about regular birds. I do know that, you can see chickadees and stuff out there right now. They're very small, and you might think, why are they not freezing to death?
You poor ducks that are listening. She's a speciesist. She just said the regular birds and excluded you ducks from being a regular bird.
The songbirds are, they don't seem cold, but it's because they're so tiny and their little hearts beat so fast that they stay warm.
The #1 podcast for birds, writing podcasts for birds, and you're insulting an entire genus species of bird.
So if you want to learn more about birds, subscribe to our podcast because we talk about it a lot. But also, we would absolutely love for you to give us a star rating and review if you are getting anything out of this podcast so that others can find us. Share it with your friends. If you want to keep up to date on whenever we're doing webinars and things like that, we have lots of opportunities coming up. You can subscribe to the podcast if you go to writebettertogether.com, and on the homepage there is a form that you can fill out to receive a newsletter.
We need some more emails, by the way.
I know. I would love to hear from everybody.
Emily wants to hear from you. I just want to collect your email addresses.
Oh, I see.
I'm kidding. I want to hear from you too. You guys are missing my hilarious jokes I slide into my weekly releasing of the podcast every Tuesday. All right. What happens now? What do we do?
I think it's time for the final act.
Oh, you'll be playing for this Christmas ornament from Jack in the Box. Oh, it's Jack. And but look, it's 2-dimensional. What kind of Christmas ornament is that? But I forgot to give it to you at Christmas. I bought it because I could mail it because it's flat. But there you go. Thanks, Jack in the Box. All right, so today's game, I guess we're going to do, I was going to do Stitch Incoming, but then I figured that's too easy. So I'm going to do Complete the Phrase, right? And so you're going to watch a scene. I'm going to play like 3 sentences, and then you're going to guess the next sentence. And then
I'm not just coming up with my own thing. I have to guess accurately what they say.
Well, you can come up with your own thing, but if it's close, then I'm going to do it 3 times, so you get 3 points, and then to win, or 2 out of 3. And then if you're close, then I'll give it to you. You don't have to be exact. Sure. Now, people at home, there are cuss words at the end of this video, so don't go on your own exploring off into the internet and watch the rest of the video. The first few minutes there's no cuss words, but like in the 6-minute video, 8 minutes, there's some at the end, so no adventuring. All right, here we go.
Complete the phrase.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Alrighty. You already know this?
This is my favorite video.
Oh, it's only 8 years old. I was afraid you might know. All right, so this will be even better because will you be able to complete the phrases? We'll find out. Ready?
I might have the song almost memorized.
Oh, man.
But,
all right, well, then you can win.
I can prove it. I've studied.
Unlike you, I don't try to trip you up. I want you to win, where you try to sabotage my attempts at the game.
I'm so excited.
Every other week. All right, here we go.
This is the best thing ever.
Angelic yodel.
You should know that the man with the power of nature can bring you to the end of your life. And you should know by my style.
All right.
And the look in my eye that you're about to be massively forced to give up.
I picked an easier game for you. I
went down instead of up with those because I realized I can't go high.
The only reason I chose this is because I was going to make jokes about Misty running out and coming trying to grab one of these chickens away from this guy.
So people, you got to watch this video.
No, there's bad words at the end.
But okay, there's a family-friendly one on Spotify. But basically, you're looking at a Japanese setting, a Japanese man holding a chicken, but he's also wearing like what do you call the yodel outfit?
If it was bullfighting, it would be like a bolero outfit.
Yeah, it's like but he's
not bullfighting. He's getting ready to do something else.
Anyway, I'll let you continue.
We have to see if you're right, first of all.
Oh, right. I could be wrong, I guess.
Look in my eyes that you are about to be massively forced to give up.
Okay, You got the first one right. Good job.
Yay.
All right, here we go.
Okay.
Chicken attack. Chicken attack.
All right, what comes after before it fades to black?
Oh, wait, now I'm drawing a blank on here. Watch your back before it fades to black. They may look harmless, but this has a swear word in it too. They'll kick your non-chicken butt, is what he says.
So we're gonna have to bleep that.
Yeah.
Way to go, Emily. All right, last thing. I don't know. I was gonna say couplet, but it might be more than a couplet. Next few lines. Here we go.
All right.
So you're two for two. Who knew? Yeah. All right, here we go.
Go chicken go, go chicken go, now gonna fly.
Okay, next line.
I think this one actually is tricky. I think he says, "You own the sky," and then he says, "Wait." You own go chicken go. Oh no, I can't remember what happens after that. It's something about I think he might go to the other verse where he says you should know by now that no, you should know by now that
I didn't know this was going to be so painful for you.
Oh, you should know by now that the power of nature will bring you to the end of your luck, I think. Unless that's what he said earlier.
Do you need to phone a friend? You need to call Misty.
No, it's okay. I accept
chicken language.
I'll accept the failure of this last one.
Oh, let's find out.
Okay. Okay, got that part right.
That part right.
With the power of nature, you're never alone, and you can't leave it on a man.
You want to pause that part.
Leave it right there.
Yeah. So no, I went back to the original verse instead of moving to the second verse.
Wah, wah, wah.
I will say, I know he said not to watch it, but towards the end, he goes into full yodel, and it's amazing. So it's worth it. But it is explicit language, so definitely don't watch around your kids.
Don't watch it even if you're grown up. There's no possible redeeming. It's not Shakespeare. There's no reason why you need to have those cuss words in your life.
Well, thank you for letting me relive that.
A long time ago in a church I went to in Ohio, they would teach, if you can't show it behind the pulpit, behind the pastor preaching, you shouldn't be watching it.
Wow. Wow. I will say again, there is a family-friendly, just audible version on Spotify. If you just want to hear the yodel, because it's impressive.
That's good to know. Oh, I think you won. Merry Christmas.
Yay.
in the end of January. One thing I wanted to mention was that this won't air until February, but you mentioned Stephanie Jones earlier, and we had her on during National Mentoring Month in January.
I know, we didn't even know.
We didn't even mention it. So I wanted to mention that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was we couldn't have done without you.
Oh, man, you got me again. We couldn't have done it without you.